By the time Bertrand Russell was 4 years old, diphtheria and bronchitis had taken his mother, his sister, and his father. He was left in a cavernous, quiet mansion, an orphaned boy looking for order in a world that had proven to be unpredictable and tragic. Pembroke Lodge was governed by his grandmother, Countess Russell. She imposed strict Presbyterian rules, isolating him from his peers, and educating him entirely through private tutors. He spent his youth wandering the expansive grounds in solitude, quietly questioning the rigid dogmas handed down. This is the title page of Oliver Burns' Elements of Euclid. When Russell was 11, his older brother Frank introduced him to this specific geometry. The axiomatic proofs, where one truth leads undeniably to the next, were a revelation. Human affairs were fraught with sorrow and sudden loss. Mathematics offered a realm of absolute certainty. It was a space where truths were immortal, immune to grief, opinion, or strict grandmothers. He decided to dedicate his life to this discipline. He wanted to prove that the universe, or at least human knowledge of it, could be anchored to perfect, unbreakable mathematical certainty. Russell arrived at Trinity College, Cambridge, in 1890. Here, the academic establishment was devoted to British idealism, a philosophy treating reality as a single, coherent spiritual whole, where individual objects and particulars were treated as mere illusions. Alongside his colleague G.E. Moore, Russell rebelled against this holistic view. They championed external relations, arguing that the world consists of a plurality of distinct, independent entities. Reality exists independent of the human mind, and they demanded a philosophy grounded in objective verification. At the 1900 International Congress of Philosophy in Paris, Russell encountered the Italian mathematician Giuseppe Peano, who had developed a precise system of symbolic logic. Russell quickly recognized this syntax as the exact instrument of logical analysis he had been searching for. He adopted this syntax for the logicist program. The core hypothesis was that mathematics is not a separate discipline at all, but an extension of pure logic. Every mathematical theorem, he argued, could be derived from a few simple logical axioms. If he could complete this proof, he would achieve his childhood dream. He would establish a permanent, unshakable foundation for all human reasoning. He spent the next decade collaborating with his former teacher, Alfred North Whitehead, on a massive 3-volume work called Principia Mathematica. They intended to reduce all numbers and arithmetic down to purely logical constants. Their entire system relied heavily on naive set theory. This rests on the concept of unrestricted comprehension, the idea that you can take absolutely any property and group them to define a valid set. In 1901, while analyzing the foundational work of the German logician Gottlob Frege, Russell discovered a fatal mathematical contradiction that broke the rules of set theory. This is Russell's paradox, the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. If it contains itself, it violates the rule. If it doesn't, it fits the rule and must be added. The logic loops endlessly. In classical logic, a single contradiction allows any statement to be proven true or false. Because of this single loop, the absolute certainty Russell sought was structurally broken. Russell wrote a letter to Frege explaining the paradox. The message arrived just as the second volume of Frege's life's work was going to print, effectively devastating the German mathematician's entire project. To rescue Principia Mathematica, Russell spent years developing a workaround called the theory of types. He created a strict hierarchy, where sets only contain elements of a lower tier, mathematically banning self-reference. It patched the hole, but the pristine elegance was gone. The system required complicated axioms, proving mathematics has inherent limitations. The abstract world could not provide a flawless refuge from the inconsistencies of life. Having exhausted the limits of pure logic, Russell turned his analytical mind outward, toward the chaos of the real world. He took the rigorous tools of logical analysis he developed for numbers and applied them to human society. He began systematically deconstructing the dogmas and traditions of the British establishment. When World War I broke out, his vocal pacifism cost him his lectureship at Trinity College. He refused to abandon his principles, a stance that eventually resulted in a 5-month prison sentence. In 1927, he and his second wife, Dora, founded the experimental Beacon Hill School. They sought to replace authoritarian educational regimes, which relied on corporal punishment and religious hierarchy, with an environment built on free thought and empirical evidence. Decades later, his appointment to teach at the City College of New York was revoked. A judge ruled him morally unfit to teach due to his progressive writings advocating for secularism and sexual freedom. He repeatedly faced professional and legal retaliation from polite society, yet he continued to subject human affairs to relentless logical scrutiny, cementing his place as a leading, fearless intellectual. As he reached his 80s, Russell focused his activism on what he saw as the ultimate existential threat: the proliferation of nuclear weapons. In 1914, the ordered stability of the European continent shattered. As nations plunged into the mass violence of the First World War, governments demanded absolute ideological conformity and nationalistic loyalty from their citizens. Bertrand Russell had every incentive to comply. Born into the British aristocracy and already recognized as a mathematical genius, he occupied the highest tier of elite society. Instead, he openly rejected the war effort. Photographs from the era capture a man of unwavering analytical intensity. He applied the same rigorous logic to global politics that he did to mathematics, concluding that the conflict was a senseless destruction of human life. The academic establishment tolerated no dissent. Prosecuted under the Defense of the Realm Act for his anti-war writings, Russell was convicted in 1918 and sentenced to 5 months in Brixton Prison. Inside cell 2917, he simply went back to work. He spent his sentence writing his Introduction to Mathematical Philosophy, proving that while the state could lock up his physical body, it could not halt his intellectual output. The slaughter of the war made it clear to Russell that the existing social order was actively destructive. He concluded that if humanity was going to survive its own technological progress, the very way children were taught to think had to be torn down and rebuilt. In 1927, he attempted to put this theory into practice. He established the Beacon Hill School on a 200-acre estate in West Sussex as a laboratory for progressive, democratic education. While the public naturally associated the institution with the famous philosopher, it was his wife, Dora Russell, who served as the true operational force in running the school day to day. The curriculum was deliberately provocative, offering total freedom of speech, optional attendance, and rejecting religious dogma. The public was horrified. Apocryphal rumors spread, including a fabricated story of a local rector greeted by a naked child who declared, "There is no God." Bertrand and Dora divorced in 1935, and his direct involvement with the project faded. Yet Dora navigated chronic financial shortages to keep the school running on her own until the Second World War forced its closure. The relentless public hostility directed at Beacon Hill revealed a clear cultural anxiety. An authoritative society is deeply threatened by children who are explicitly taught to question everything. By 1940, Russell had relocated to the United States. The College of the City of New York voted unanimously to hire him to teach logic and mathematics. The appointment drew immediate outrage. Episcopal Bishop William Thomas Manning launched a public campaign against him, labeling Russell a recognized propagandist against religion and morality. This sparked a bizarre lawsuit. A taxpayer named Jean Kay sued, claiming her daughter would be compromised, even though the college was all male. The court proceedings completely bypassed his academic qualifications. Instead, the arguments focused entirely on his earlier books advocating for sexual freedom and atheism. Judge John E. McGeehan delivered a devastating ruling. He officially revoked the appointment and judicially declared one of the 20th century's greatest minds legally, morally unfit to teach. The ruling stripped Russell of his livelihood. A subsequent teaching stint at the Barnes Foundation in Pennsylvania ended in an equally abrupt and contentious dismissal. The New York trial laid bare a harsh reality. Even within a democracy, the legal system could be swiftly weaponized to financially ruin and silence an intellectual who held unpopular views. Stranded in America during the Second World War, Russell found himself judicially blacklisted and completely out of money. Rather than quietly retreating, he took the philosophical lectures he had been banned from delivering and compiled them into a single volume, A History of Western Philosophy. The book became a massive commercial success, securing his financial independence for the rest of his life. The institutions that had rejected him eventually reversed course. Trinity College invited him back to his old post, and in 1950 he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. With his academic reputation restored, Russell directed his energy toward the existential threat of nuclear weapons, co-authoring a historic anti-nuclear manifesto alongside Albert Einstein. His activism mobilized thousands. At 89 years old, he was sent back to prison for taking part in anti-nuclear protests in London, refusing a magistrate's offer to avoid jail in exchange for a pledge of good behavior. In his final years, he continued to demand accountability from global powers. He organized an international tribunal to investigate the United States' conduct in the Vietnam War, working alongside intellectuals like Jean-Paul Sartre. The massive youth resistance movements of the 1960s embraced his lifelong defiance. His message of questioning authority and demanding peace had finally found its era. Bertrand Russell's life demonstrates that the rebellion of the mind is not an isolated battle. True intellectual freedom requires the courage to face continuous persecution without ever surrendering the truth. In October 1948, a flying boat carrying 43 people approached a Norwegian fjord in heavy winds. Upon landing, the hull tore open, water rushed in, and the aircraft began to sink. For the passengers trapped inside the forward cabins, the situation was catastrophic. The icy waters of the Hummelvik fjord flooded the compartment, drowning 19 people before they could reach an exit. Among those who managed to swim to safety was a 76-year-old British aristocrat, the mathematical logician Bertrand Russell. This layout of the aircraft reveals the improbable mechanics of his survival. Russell was a lifelong smoker and had requested a seat in the smoking section, located at the very back of the plane. When the fuselage snapped, the forward non-smoking cabins submerged immediately, but the tail section remained above the surface just long enough for him to climb out. He survived because of a random, dangerous habit. That intimate brush with drowning provided a visceral baseline for a man who would soon be forced to calculate the mortality of the human species. Russell spent the majority of his life far from physical danger, seeking absolute, unshakable truths through the cold precision of mathematical proofs and analytical philosophy. But as the post-war world took shape, his commitment to logic collided with the behavior of human societies. Despite the recent devastation of World War II, nations were already rushing to develop tools that were profoundly irrational in their destructive capacity. Having just felt the freezing reality of his own death in that Norwegian fjord, Russell began to apply his logical rigor to a world that seemed increasingly intent on its own destruction. In 1950, Russell traveled to Stockholm to be awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. Given his background in technical logic, many expected a lecture on the philosophy of language or mathematics. Instead, he used the podium to dissect the primal psychological drivers behind human behavior. He argued that political history is not driven by reason, but by what he called the four infinite desires. The first three are acquisitiveness, the urge to possess goods, vanity, the need for attention, and rivalry, the drive to surpass others. To illustrate the irrationality of acquisitiveness, he shared an observation of two Estonian girls he had sheltered after they narrowly escaped starvation. Despite having plenty to eat in his home, they spent their leisure hours stealing and hoarding potatoes from neighboring fields, driven by a fear that could not be reasoned away. Because these desires are infinite, they remain ungratified even in times of plenty, pushing human societies toward restlessness and conflict regardless of material progress. But the fourth pillar on this chart represents the most potent driver of history, the love of power. Russell identified this as the direct capacity to make other human beings do what they would rather not do. He saw this specific desire as the primary engine of all geopolitical struggle. Throughout history, the damage caused by this pursuit of power was naturally contained by the primitive technology of the time. Armies were limited by geography and the slow pace of ancient weaponry. The ultimate tragedy of the human condition, as Russell saw it, was the pairing of these infinite, irrational desires with the newly unbounded capabilities of modern military science. The dawn of the thermonuclear age was marked by the Castle Bravo test, introducing a scale of energy that broke all historical precedent. The hydrogen bomb was 2,500 times more powerful than the weapon that destroyed Hiroshima. This introduced a global threat, radioactive fallout. Particles from a thermonuclear blast reach the upper atmosphere and sink gradually across the planet in the form of deadly dust. In this new environment, the traditional objectives of war became mathematically impossible to achieve. The scale of the fallout meant that an all-out nuclear conflict would leave no victor behind. The stakes had moved beyond the defeat of an army or the fall of a nation. The biological existence of the species was now in doubt. Russell recognized the logical implications of these technical developments. If his equations showed that war now equated to the end of the species, then his role as a philosopher had to shift from detached analysis to urgent political intervention. This realization led to the 1955 Russell-Einstein Manifesto, an unprecedented warning issued alongside Albert Einstein in the final days of the physicist's life. The manifesto appealed to the public to set aside their strong feelings regarding communism or anti-communism and consider themselves only as members of a biological species whose continued existence was in peril. He argued for a species consciousness, where our shared biological survival must take precedence over any national or religious identity. This message ignited a global movement, shifting the debate over nuclear weapons from academic journals to massive street protests and the campaign for nuclear disarmament. Russell's appeal was directed at the most fundamental level of survival. Remember your humanity and forget the rest. He argued that we are faced with a definitive choice. Shall we put an end to the human race, or shall mankind renounce war?